Hi, welcome to part 46 on the Lackawanna Cut-Off, where we're going to be talking about abandonment, the 13 villains who almost destroyed the cut-off. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, and we're here at the Delaware River Viaduct to talk about the abandonment of the cut-off, which you might say, well, that's an easy story to tell. It was abandoned by Conrail. Officially in 1981, they petitioned for abandonment, and then the tracks come up in 1984, end of story. But it isn't that simple. It's actually a long story, a continuum, if you will, of events that lead to the abandonment of the cutoff. And there are 13 villains, I'll call them, bad guys, whatever you want to refer to them as, that are on this list. Conrail is on there. They're actually number 12, which means that there are 11 villains before, chronologically, and one after. So, to start, where do we start? Well, let's start with President Truesdale. You think, oh my gosh, we're going way back. Truesdale takes over the Lackawanna in 1899. By 1906, they're looking to build the cutoff. They've actually surveyed a number of different routes, and they've settled on which route they want to use. But at the time, Truesdale warns that there's going to be problems the following year, 1907. And he predicts the panic of 1907. So the building of the cutoff, the start of the construction, is delayed until 1908 and will continue on until 1911. But Truesdale also at the time of the prediction, if you will, of the panic, he also warns about federal meddling in operations of railroads. And that'll be proved to be quite prescient because as we get into the late teens, 1918 about, we're talking about World War I, the federal government will take over, nationalize the railroads in the U.S., including the Lackawanna. So in 1920, the federal government gives back, if you will, the operation of the railroads to the railroads. Which brings us to the first villain, as I'll call it. And not all these villains are actually individuals, I'll say. The first one, though, it's very interesting what happens here because it predicts the possibility of future events. 1920, the federal government, after they give back the railroads, there's also what is called the Ripley Act. Now, the Ripley Act is basically a proposal to place the major railroads, I'll say, relatively speaking, the larger railroads, into 21 different networks. The Lackawanna was going to end up with the Chesapeake and Ohio and Nickel Plate and the Erie and a few others, I think Paramount Marquette and a few others, into a regional type of approach. It never happens. But the Nickel Plate Lackawanna relationship is going to come back and again and again in this whole narrative. Unfortunately, what happens is, and these are, I'll call them the villains, and this is a story that will continue to this present day, even with the Union Pacific wanting to take over Norfolk Southern. The investors are not interested in doing this kind of merging, if you will, even if they were kind of a loose type of merging relationship between these railroads in 1920. The reason being is investors look at their little fiefdoms as, well, we make money here. I'm not interested necessarily what good or bad happens out of what comes out of what happens with my investment. I just want to get my dividend. I want to get my profits. So there's going to be a lot of short-sighted thinking. Anyway, bottom line is nothing happens out of the Ripley Act. Though what might have helped in terms of regionalizing railroads to put all the, say, the strengths and weaknesses together so that these systems would have operated more efficiently, just never happened. What's interesting, in 1924, there's an analysis done of that. And what is looked at is that the nickel plate and Lackawanna were looked at as, once again, as possible merger partners. But at that time, the analysis that I looked at said basically the Lackawanna is in excellent shape. The nickel plate, which was not a railroad which operated from Buffalo west, the Lackawanna is from Buffalo east. So here you would be marrying two railroads that would cover a good portion of the eastern, well, all of the eastern and certainly part of the Midwest, all the way to St. Louis. It says the problem with that merger would have been that the nickel plate would have to be brought up to higher standards to meet that of the Lackawanna. Further, that analysis in 1924 mentions that the Erie and the Lackawanna together would be a bad fit. That's an interesting observation. So there we are as we go into the mid-1920s. President Truesdale, who is the big builder for the Lackawanna, relinquishes control as presidency to John Davis in 1925. Davis is the weakest of all the presidents that will ever inhabit the president's office of the Lackawanna, dating back into the 1800s. There are a number of things. I won't make him into a villain, but he's really, I don't have the heart to do that, but he's really, from the way from what I've read, he really wasn't interested in being president. He had his underlings actually run the company for the most part. He'd show up, get pictures taken, but for the most part, he was not interested in being president. And this is going to cause a problem because he's going to be president during the Depression, the Great Depression, up until 1941, which is basically where you get into World War II. And at that point, William White, Bill White, and we're going to be hearing more from Mr. White, will take over the Lackawanna as president. And he's going to carry the ball, so to speak, through the Second World War as well as into the 1950s, early 1950s. So now we come to our, I'll say is our second villain. 1948, President White of the Lackawanna proposes that the Lackawanna would be able to use its stock. It's bought a whole bunch of stock in the Nickel Plate Road. The Nickel Plate Road, by the way, is also known as the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, but everyone referred to it as the Nickel Plate. That stock would be used to get two directors on the board of directors of the Nickel Plate in anticipation of hopefully having a merger between the Nickel Plate and the Lackawanna. The Interstate Commerce Commission rejects that. And so the ICC, as they were referred to as, becomes our second villain. Because if that merger had taken place, 1948, things might have turned out quite a bit different for the Lackawanna. And maybe even for the Nickel Plate, because they're going to end up, well, they'll be ending up with the Norfolk and Western a little bit. We'll talk about them. So as we now go into the 50s, 1952, Perry Shoemaker takes over as president of the Lackawanna. Now, Shoemaker is going to basically follow the same playbook, if you will. He understands that there's a number of factors that are playing against the Lackawanna. The taxes in New Jersey, the operation of the commuter lines, which are losing money, and he also still has that stock and from the Nickel Plate. And what he does, he goes to the ICC, and the ICC will reject the application or the proposal again. Only this time, I'm going to make the villain the guy from the Nickel Plate. The president or the head of the Nickel Plate at that point was Lynn White. No relation to Bill or William White of the Lackawanna that I'm aware of. Lynn, L-Y-N-N-E, a man, an unusual spelling for, or unusual name for a man, but he apparently is fearful that in a merger that Shoemaker would get the job and he'd lose his job. So he's against it. Anyway, we make him villain number 3. So as we go through the 1950s, we see a number of things that are going to adversely affect the Lackawanna. So villain number 4 isn't the person, it's the taxes that the county of Hudson County, notoriously corrupt, is basically charging the Lackawanna. It also charges any other railroad that happens to operate in Hudson County as well. The railroads are looked at as a cash cow. So this is a big burden for the Lackawanna. So they're number 4. The state government in New Jersey, and I'll throw in the state of New York as well, become number 5. They're not helpful for different reasons. The Lackawanna is urgently trying to get subsidies from the state of New Jersey because of their commuter operations, which are losing money. In New York State, there's what they call feather bedding. So you're paying money, extra money for basically extra workers on board a freight train that you don't really need. That's number 5. Number 6 isn't a person either, but it's a biggie. One of the biggies of that it's going to, when we're talking about abandonment, the cutoff, I know we're way ahead, but these things are moving in that direction. Number 6 is a storm. Actually, it's 2 storms. The remnants of Hurricane Connie come through this area here in northeastern Pennsylvania, August of 1955. It veers to the west and goes up to the Ohio Valley. 5 days later, the remnants of Hurricane Diane come through here and then will veer up and go into New England and devastate Connecticut, but it will devastate this area and the Lackawanna in particular. The Lackawanna will be cut in 88 different places. Between 10 and 15 inches causes, well, the Delaware behind me was probably lapping up to the top of the banks of the river here at that point. But the Diane causes devastation, and not only devastation, but ultimately over $8 million in damage, which today would be over $100 million, probably $150 million in damage, equivalent. It's difficult to come up with equivalent numbers, but we're talking about a very, very large amount. And it's not only just the damage, which has to be repaired, but there's, for the better part of a month, the railroad is out of operation, and it's having to send trains over other railroads. And, well, anyway, long story short, it's a disaster. So that's number 6. And that's going to cause financial problems going down because the railroad has to pay for that. So number 7 is the political lobbies that, and this is going to continue on, not just in the 1950s, but the political lobbies for highways and for the airlines. The lobbies will get stronger and stronger as time goes on, to the point where they really almost run the show, so to speak, in terms of money. And the railroads are competing against these 2 forms of transportation, which are heavily subsidized and have been heavily subsidized. This isn't a story really that started in the 1950s, although it really starts to burgeon because you have the interstate highway system, which starts in the 1950s. But the federal government is building roads back before the First World War, and it will accelerate as we go on through time. And railroads are competing against that. For freight, in terms of the highways, because you have trucking, and you can argue that maybe the railroads are their own worst enemies. We could talk about that. But And then passenger, what happens with that is that, well, you have airlines, which are their airports, and the traffic controllers are all subsidized or paid for by the federal government. The railroads are competing against this. And in a sense, they're going to lose that battle, basically. There's no way you can win a battle where the federal government is subsidizing your competitors, to the point where there's just all this, in a sense, the house of cards is going to fall. And that's where we're headed towards. As we get into the late 1950s, the Lackawanna, specifically Perry Shoemaker, sees the writing on the wall. So Villa number 8 becomes a report, the Wire-Dick report, or the Wire report is often referred to as. This is a document that is used to justify the merger, eventually leads to the Erie-Lackawanna merger, but it starts with the Delaware and Hudson, who's president at William White. Sound familiar? Somehow William White and Perry Shoemaker get together, and then the Erie. So you have three parties originally, D&H, Lackawanna, Erie, who are talking about merging. And there would be consolidation of trackage, and there will be also the movement of all the operations into Hoboken Terminal in anticipation of this merger. But the Wire-Dick report projects all sorts of savings that will accrue from merging these three railroads. The problem is that the Wire-Dick report, it leaves out so many details and overlooks so many things that it's basically a fraudulent, for all intents and purposes, document. Now, as we go through the 1950s, the D&H, Mr. White, is going to get cold feet, and he's going to pull the D&H out of that merger. So the Wire-Dick report has to be updated now so that there's only going to be two railroads in this merger, Erie and Lackawanna. And when the two entities merge in 1960, they're going to be relying on this document as guidance, if you will, to how they're going to merge these two entities. The problem is that the Wire-Dick report really is just not even worth the paper it's written on, because it leaves out so many things that would be important for a merger to be successful. Today, mergers and acquisitions is a specialty in both law and business. But in those days, it was in its infancy. And railroad mergers were, the Erie-Lackawanna is really one of the first major mergers of railroads. So this is uncharted territory. I mean, some of the things, the problem with merging the Erie and the Lackawanna will be that these are two separate railroads. Obviously two separate railroads, but they're railroads that are operated in different ways. So I think stories that you can tell, because I remember you saying that there was, and talking about the railroads, that there was some railroad executive that you used to bring into New York. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, do I remember them? Yeah. Two of them. I forget the name. One lived up in, not in Glen Ridge, and the other guy lived on Park Avenue in East Orange. These guys used to go to the gay bars, and they'd spend half the night. Then they'd call a taxi and to pick them up. And I took the limousine, and I went to pick the guy up. And he keeps you sitting there and sitting there. The guy on Park Avenue, he was nice. I took him home, and you charge yourself a big tip. You know, they charged everything to the railroad, Erie Railroad. They charged at the gay bar, they charged the tip, everything to the railroad.
Yeah,
then this bum from Glen Ridge, I took him up, kept me waiting, loaded him up, And he was so drunk, he's giving me a hard time. He said he wanted to go over to Washington Bridge to go home. So I get ready to go over to Washington Bridge. And he's yelling, "Who told you to go this way?" I said, "You told me." I said, "You told me to go over to Washington Bridge, and that's what I'm doing." And he started cursing me and everything else. Well, guess what? I pulled in the middle of the bridge. I'd say, "Sir, get out of my cab. You're going to walk home." Oh, he said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Well, are you going to sit back there and shut up and let me do the driving? Or you want to get off here?" Well, he got back on, he kept quiet. I dropped him off in Glen Ridge. I went back to the office, and I no sooner get in there, because, it was the night this way. I pick up the phone, it's him. He said, "Sir, I want to file a complaint. Somebody wanted to let me off at the Washington Bridge." He says, "Be sure he doesn't charge a tip." Hung up, I charged myself the tip. He was real. Everything, and he charged it too to the railroad. Everything he did, the limousine, the bar, everything charged to the Erie Railroad. You wonder why they're broke?
I'm wondering how much money these guys were spending.
They spend it. They were every couple of nights they were hanging out in New York in the bar.
Really?
So I got tired of going there. I sent somebody else to pick him up. I let him use the limo and say, "Go and pick this guy up. I'll stay on the board. And call me if you have any trouble."
So at this point, you're...
That's why your railroad is broke.
Well, I wonder about that, because if you have a couple of guys like that, there must be more that were doing
I'm sure
some of the same stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure there were more. But these guys were top officials. They were presidents and vice presidents, whatever they were.
So they're big shots.
Big shot. Oh, yeah. But the guy on Park Avenue, he was always nice. He said, "Bill, charge yourself a big tip, and here's a little something extra for you." He always give me a 20 or whatever.
Which was a lot of money in those days.
Yes, yeah.
We're talking talking about what year now?
He lived right around the corner from where I used to live. But he was really nice. But still, he charged to the Erie Railroad. I think it was Erie, yeah.
The Erie or the Erie Lackawanna?
No, Erie.
It was the Erie, okay. That would put it back in the late 50s.
Yeah.
The philosophies are different, the cultures are different. And then the way that is handled in terms of integrating the two railroads, which run parallel. The reason why the Lackawanna would have been done so much better with the nickel plate is that it would have been an end-to-end merger. In other words, you have Hoboken, Binghamton, Buffalo, and that would have been the Lackawanna. Buffalo, then you have Chicago. This would all be the nickel plate. So you basically have a continuous railroad, as opposed to the Erie, which, in retrospect, Perry Shoemaker, who said, I wish I hadn't done it.
Perry Shoemaker made the deal. I keep calling him Perry. He liked to be addressed Mr. Shoemaker.
So I heard.
Yeah. I called him Perry once on the phone, and he had told Williver that...
Yes, that's who I heard it from.
Right. So from then on, it was Mr. Shoemaker. And up until the last time I talked to him, he answers the phone, Shoemaker. You know, he's in a hospital bed. On my first honeymoon.
He died just before Y2K. It was like the end of December of 1999, if memory serves. He didn't make it.
I was in Florida for something, and I called asking if I could visit. He wouldn't take visitors. He said, "I'm not in any shape for visitors. He goes, I'm bedridden. I'm not presentable." there's nothing, there's nothing you can ask me anything you want on the phone. But we talked about a lot of stuff, including the EL merger. He had some great imparts on that.
He had regrets about the EL merger, did he not?
Very much so.
But he didn't have any alternative. The Lackawanna and the Erie were parallel railroads, so the problem is that there was ability to consolidate, but not really enough to make it work in a sense that it was going to save a lot of money. And then they really screw it up, because at the beginning it was assumed that the president of the Erie, whose name was Von Willer, was only going to temporarily be the president, and that Perry Shoemaker would move into the presidency shortly thereafter. Unfortunately, the problem is on the board of directors, 2/3 of the members were Erie people and only 1/3 was Lackawanna. So the Lackawanna gets outvoted, and instead of putting Shoemaker in there, Von Willer lasts maybe a month. He was physically unwell. He leaves after a little over a month in November of 1960. The merger was actually October 17th of 1960. Instead of Perry Shoemaker, Milton McGinnis will become president. Now McGinnis, as we will find out, is incompetent. McGinnis will become villain number 9. And you can argue that there's a Gary White who's along with him. So we maybe, in a sense, have 2 villains. We'll call them villain number 9, though, together, collectively. Erie Lackawanna management, or Erie management, really, for all intents and purposes. Gary White is the younger brother of Bill White. Totally different personality. We refer to him as the puppet master. McGinnis is the puppet. And all sorts of bad things happen out of this. Not the least of which is the financial aspect of the company goes boom, straight down the tubes, basically. They lose tons of money over the first, basically, 2.5 years of their operation. So what this means is now that the Erie Lackawanna is in dire straits. And during this time, now we get to number 10, which is a 1-2 punch here. The Erie is so desperate that they actually sell off the Boonton line through Garrett Mountain and Patterson. I've covered this in previous videos. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, and I'm president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association. And we're here on top of Garrett Mountain, overlooking Patterson, New Jersey, and in the far distance, New York. You're probably wondering what we're doing at Garrett Mountain. What does that have to do with the Lackawanna Cut-Off? And actually, it has a lot to do with the Lackawanna Cut-Off. Now, in the distance here, you can see Route 80, which is the main highway in northern New Jersey, runs from just west of the George Washington Bridge all the way to the Oakland Bay Bridge in San Francisco. From here below us is Route 19. Now you're wondering, what am I getting into talking about highways for? Well, Route 19 and Route 80, following this particular alignment, was the Boonton line, or in the days that it was built, the Boonton branch of the Lackawanna Railroad, over which all freight from Hoboken, Secaucus, to east on the Lackawanna went west to Port Morris and over the Cut-Off. Now the Boonton branch was built 1869, 1870, and was a bypass to the Morristown line. But the Boonton branch was essentially a cutoff between the west side of the Bergen tunnels, just outside of Hoboken, and Denville. And for almost 100 years, was the main freight line in northern New Jersey for the Lackawanna. Now, when the cutoff was built, trains had been running over the Boonton branch back and forth for over 40 years. It was a low-grade line, had very few grade crossings, and went through this. It wasn't called a notch per se, but it was a gap between Garrett Mountain and Gothel Hill, which is north, but this is the Watchung Range in New Jersey. But this was really a key place for the railroad to go through, and in fact it actually took advantage of another gap west of here. So when the builders of the Boonton branch were contemplating this particular line, they knew that this is one place they needed to go through. Now, how does this all impact the cutoff? Well, yes, it was the freight line for a number of years that trains over the cutoff would come east and would go through here, through Patterson, around this sweeping curve, through the gap over here, and westbound the same way. Fast forward to the early 60s, and this is after the merger between the Erie and the Lackawanna, creating the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad, where in 1960, when there was the merger, that the management, which was primarily Erie people who took over the Erie-Lackawanna, who became part of the Erie-Lackawanna management, shifted virtually all freight traffic from here up via the Erie, which actually would go in this trajectory and that way, way to the east of where we are here for the most part. By 1963, the Erie-Lackawanna in the previous 2 years had lost $43 million. They would lose another 15 or 20 in 1963, but in 1963, there was an opportunity presented to them where they could make money by selling off this section of the Boonton branch to the New Jersey Highway Department. The New Jersey Highway Department would later become the Department of Transportation, the New Jersey DOT. But in those days, they were the Highway Department. Now, the Highway Department really wanted to have this access to this gap here. As you can see, this is Route 80. The Route 80 goes right through here. However, the Lackawanna, or at that point, the Erie-Lackawanna, had two tracks that went through that gap. And in fact, I've had a couple of conversations with my friend John Williver, who he worked originally for the Lackawanna and then got a job with the Highway Department in the like 1956, 1957, and actually was part of the team that was tasked with condemning land to create Route 80. And he told me the story that the then commissioner of the, or whatever the head of the Highway Department was called in those days, came to the right-of-way team or division and said that and they had been condemning land adjacent to the Boonton branch. In other words, they were not at that point contemplating taking the right-of-way of the Boonton branch, as would eventually happen. But the commissioner had come up with a brilliant idea that, well, why don't we see if the Erie-Lackawanna might be willing to sell part of the right-of-way. And at that point, as I mentioned, the Erie-Lackawanna is in the red and in desperate straits as far as cash is concerned. So what happens is that the Highway Department approaches the Erie-Lackawanna and offers that money to buy the right-of-way. And because at that point in time, the Erie-Lackawanna had shifted all freight traffic away from the Boonton branch, they figured, oh, we don't really need this. And we can make a bunch of money. Actually, it would turn out to be like $2 million, but We're talking now 55 years ago, so $2 million was quite a bit of money in those days, and it would have at least helped somewhat toward the bottom line. However, the decision was going to come back to haunt the Erie Lackawanna big time, and come back to haunt the Cut-Off, as a matter of fact, as well. But in any case, to finish the story with John Williver, what happened was then the highway department worked out a deal where the Erie Lackawanna could keep one track. Now this is where the story gets a little muddy, and then I'm going to give my opinion on what actually happened here. The Erie Lackawanna eventually ended up selling the entire right-of-way. In other words, Route 80, there's no tracks anywhere, but we'll actually show you where, or at least we'll try to show you, along the section of where there were tracks. But the Erie Lackawanna basically was willing to dump this right-of-way to get their $2 million. But the highway department really didn't expect that was going to happen. Now, the story that has always been told publicly has been that the highway department was only willing to give the EL, the Erie Lackawanna, money in the event that they sold the entire right-of-way and didn't keep any tracks. But that can't be possibly true, and here's why. In eminent domain, which is another word for condemnation, in eminent domain, the condemning party, in this case it would be the state of New Jersey, the highway department, is obligated to pay the landowner, in this case the Erie Lackawanna, fair market value for whatever they take, be it land, could be right-of-way, could be buildings, whatever the case may be. So to say that they would leave room for one track, in other words, they take right-of-way and only leave one track behind, means that they would have taken, and this is a section, it's several miles, as a matter of fact, I'm going to guess 3-4 miles of right-of-way, they would have to pay the Erie Lackawanna, they'd be obligated legally to pay the Erie Lackawanna for what they took, irrespective of what it took to somehow get one track to go through this section with highway ramps that were going to be built and the highways themselves and so forth. So basically the story that somehow that the Erie Lackawanna wasn't going to get any money for leaving one track behind is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It cannot be. It's legally impossible. My opinion, what happened was that the Erie Lackawanna made up that story to justify them dumping the whole section of track and selling it off to the state of New Jersey. I think that's what happened. And the story that's been told over the years, and it's been repeated, it's in Thomas Tabor's book, I've seen it in other books as well, is, in my view, untrue. It's false. A lie, if you wish. Basically, that's what it is. Now, how does this affect the Cut-Off? Well, in 1963, October of 1963, the last trains come through here, and they start tearing up the track and the right-of-way and planning for the highway and so forth. Now, what happens is that there's several different changes that are made to the traffic patterns for the Erie Lackawanna. This takes away the operation of the Boonton line. It changes it, it puts it in, onto a different line which is inadequate for the purposes of running through freight from Hoboken to Buffalo, over the Cut-Off, of course. I'm going to cut here to a short snippet from Bill Shepard, who talks about this.
When the Erie Lackawanna came in, it was led by former Erie people, okay, who agreed to eliminate the Boonton line between Patterson Junction and around Garrett Mountain so that I-80 Interstate 80 could be built. Instead, the freight trains were rerouted via the Greenwood Lake branch and over a pretty stiff grade at Great Notch. Okay? That wasn't a big concern to the Erie guys because in their view, the traffic should be moving via the former Erie anyway.
And it would be for quite some time.
Yes, it would be. But and then this continued because as years passed, now they stripped out the double track that ran between Lincoln Park and up toward Denville, and so the Boone line became single track there. And you say, well, why is that a problem? Well, there was an internal study that was done by the Erie Lackawanna at one point that recommended that more freight trains run back on the Lackawanna side. The problem was that the Erie Lackawanna had just secured the UPS contract, and Croxton 99 wouldn't be leaving Jersey City's Croxton Yard until around 5 a.m., 5:30 in the morning. Well, guess what's going to happen? He's going to run via the Boonton line over Great Notch and face an onslaught of passenger trains with no way to get around them. So there was a series of decisions that predate Conrail, that go back to the Erie Lackawanna, where they were looking at things from a different standpoint, and they downgraded and portions of the Boonton line that was an outstanding freight route for a long time, and that's what Conrail inherited was that situation that was left to it by the Erie Lackawanna.
And that does come up, at least I understand from reading it from what was being said at the time, that when Conrail is looking at abandoning the line, that comes up. Garrett Mountain, for example, where you have basically, say, a high-speed freight route, which has now been traded in for, I'll say, a medium-speed commuter line, where you're competing with commuter trains for track time because just the way the railroad is set up.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Between Mountain View, where the Erie crossed, and Secaucus, tell me how many grade crossings there are.
Going in which direction on the Greenwood Lake?
No, on the former Lackawanna.
I want to say 0.
How many do you think there are on the Greenwood Lake branch?
A lot.
Thank you. All right. So, and you had grades and things like that as well. The line was nowhere near what the Lackawanna line was. And the reason I'm a little harsh on this is, as a kid, I rode these lines. I had the opportunity to ride the Lackawanna line, and I rode the former Erie lines, and I can tell you that Lackawanna line was outstanding, and it was just amazing, and then to see it get stripped away over the years, it just was. When Conrail inherited, we didn't inherit something that was around, all those years before. It was just a shell of itself.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that it would come back, that if we talk about the changes, Garrett Mountain particularly, that it comes back to haunt the Erie Lackawanna, and I guess you could say Conrail, but that's what they've inherited.
We inherited that.
But yeah, you can make that case in terms of that. Well, Conrail was justified.
But this is really something that Conrail, as we get to Conrail, will mention as a justification for them abandoning the cut-off and basically the Scranton side, because the inadequacy of the route that replaces the Boonton line through Patterson, Garrett Mountain, just isn't going to cut it. And today, Route 80 goes through there. So here's another case of where the highway benefits from a railroad, where basically the railroad is shooting itself in the foot. So things have gotten so bad at the Erie Lackawanna, and we don't know who did this, but somebody from the Erie Lackawanna urges William White, who we have already heard about previously, but who's the head of the Delaware and Hudson at this point, to come over to the Erie Lackawanna and basically, as Tom Tabor put it at the time, or in his book, salvage the debacle of the Erie Lackawanna. White agrees to this. He has to go to the ICC, and he gets approval for that. And so he's now going to be, in a sense, head of both D&H and the Erie Lackawanna, which, in a sense, in some ways, creates the merger that never happened. But that's contingent upon them getting rid of, or at least pushing aside, Mr. McGinnis, which happens. So White comes in, and things get a lot better. He puts the Phoebe Snow had been sidetracked by the Erie management. He puts that train back on, and it's a good PR move. And things improve through, well, into 1964 and 1966. And the company's actually making money. Economic conditions may have helped. White is one who says, I'm not the savior, but a lot of people view him as at least pulling the operation of the railroad out of the fire, basically. It was headed toward bankruptcy, and he stops the bleeding of red ink. Unfortunately, William White dies at his desk in Cleveland, and this is something he literally is almost at his desk in 1967, and this is going to change things dramatically. But you have to keep in mind now that the problem with the Erie Lackawanna, when you merge these entities together, the operation is run out of Cleveland, Ohio. Many of the problems that are haunting the Erie Lackawanna are happening in New Jersey. So there's this huge separation of geography that doesn't help this. Greg Maxwell takes over as president. He'll be the last president of the Erie Lackawanna, and he's going to last all the way through the Conrail taking over of the operation in 1976. But there's a lot of stuff that happens in between. Now, one of the things that is an interim fix, if you will, is in 1972, Derico, which is a holding company basically for the Norfolk and Western, takes over the Erie Lackawanna. This occurs after Hurricane Agnes devastates the railroad in the western part of the railroad, basically. And the company basically declares bankruptcy at that point. Before this, now we have to track the Penn Central, because now the Penn Central is which is going to become Conrail, as the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central have merged in 1968 and go bankrupt in 1970. They don't even last 2 years, basically, and go bankrupt. Penn Central is going to be the core of Conrail as we go through the 1970s. Derico is, well, I'm not going to really talk too much about Derico, but since it's basically run, I'll say, by the Norfolk and Western, which the Pennsylvania Railroad, or Penn Central, owned, you can see that there's now developing this kind of incestuous relationship between railroads, which is part of the problem. But as we go through that time, we find that things are leading toward a Conrail creation, if you will. And it's a creation of a monster, because Conrail is really intended to save the Penn Central. It's not meant to save Erie Lackawanna, the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Lehigh Valley is owned basically by Penn Central. The Reading is kind of an outlier, but the Reading Railroad is, we'll throw that into the pile, but they all, and the Lehigh Hudson River, which forget that, that was never intended for something that that Conrail would want. In fact, Conrail didn't even want Erie Lackawanna. Originally, there was a proposal for what was to be called Little Conrail. There would have been Big Conrail and then Little Conrail. Erie Lackawanna would have been part of Little Conrail. Well, the powers that be at Big Conrail essentially kill the prospects of Little Conrail, which would have contained the Erie Lackawanna. Why did they do that? Well, they see it as a zero-sum game. They're gonna, it's a big pot of money. If you have a Little Conrail, that is going to take money away from Big Conrail. So anyway, long story short, you only end up with one Conrail. And Conrail gets a whole bunch of benefits that the predecessor railroads never get. They get to their low interest loans, they get forgiveness of their debts, they get to relieve themselves of the commuter operations. It doesn't happen all overnight, but over time, they get to relinquish those. Eventually, they get rid of what they call orphan bridges. The bridges over their railroads, they argue, weren't owned by them. They didn't buy those. When the 6 railroads, or 5 railroads really, that go into Conrail they don't follow and become orphans, so to speak. And on top of it all, Conrail will be allowed to abandon any routes that it sees as money losers. Well, the cutoff becomes a huge target during that time because essentially the Penn Central, or I should say Conrail at that point, really has no interest in operating the Erie Lackawanna. It had no interest in it before, it didn't have any interest afterwards. So essentially, as far as it's concerned, it can be disposed of. But it doesn't want competition coming in. And so the Delaware and Hudson is rumored as possibly wanting to operate maybe into Port Morris over the cutoff.
The Delaware and Hudson had tough operating conditions over its North Penn division, up over the Ararat grade. I joined an effort for them to purchase the Taylor to Binghamton line, and I was included in with the D&H management in an advisory, like PR capacity. A lot of high rail trips before the acquisition, and we had a spectacular grand opening of the line on Columbus Day weekend in 1980, and we tried to go to the next step after that, which was to get the line to New Jersey. And my last trip by rail over the cutoff wasn't on the 13th of November 1979. It was later on 2 D&H high rail cars where we ran from Scranton to we might have only gone to Port Morris. Yeah, we got off in the yard and we drove back by highway to Scranton. I remember going to President McKenna myself and at a meeting saying, "Sir, do you realize that if you don't explore this opportunity, it will probably foreclose any time that you'll have your own track into Metro New York?" And he said, "We totally understand that, but we don't have the money to do it."
It never happens. They don't have the money to do it. They do. D&H actually does save the operation of the railroad between Scranton and Binghamton, including the Clark Summit Cut-Off. And that's done by, interestingly enough, Kent Shoemaker, who is the son of Perry Shoemaker, who's briefly the president of the Delaware and Hudson. Villain number 11 becomes New Jersey DOT, because there is the possibility that when we get into the 1980s with Conrail, they've abandoned the cutoff, the line basically west of Port Morris. They had the option of buying the cutoff for $1 million with track on it. They pass on the offer, so to speak. And then Conrail takes up the track. Now, what was behind that? Well, villain number 11 is the DOT and the casinos in New Jersey and Atlantic City, because there were rumors, at least at the time, that there might be casinos happening or would be happening in the Poconos, the Pocono Mountains. That's really 20 years away, but it was that boogeyman at the time. And what happens is the effort to try to buy the cutoff at that time is prevented. And then Conrail goes through a whole bunch of machinations, and we get like $6 million, and the counties in New Jersey and Pennsylvania are trying to save the line. They can't come up with the money. It looked like they did, but then they didn't. And anyway, the tracks come up in 1984. And so Conrail now becomes, as you would expect, as I mentioned before, villain number 12. But there's one more villain, and that'll be Jerry Turco. Because Jerry Turco will buy the cutoff, the right-of-way of the cutoff in 1986. And he proposes to destroy it, and he would come pretty close to being able to do that by picking up the fill and removing it to a project called Westway in New York. But the good news is what happens is that the state of New Jersey will finally come in, and they will actually end up buying the cutoff through eminent domain. Now the thing is, that's a long story with that, because I'm part of the effort to get the money, $25 million through a bond issue in 1989, that they were able to acquire the cutoff. So in a sense, the villain that they were previously, they in a sense overcome that and negate that. So they become the good guys.
The most asked question is, why is it taking so long? That rail line, the cutoff in New Jersey, was as close to dead as any rail line ever got. And in effect, it was dead, just about. It was resuscitated at the last moment through this condemnation. But when I say that, that took years and years and years. Like I said, once the railroad was sold, Conrail sold the cutoff in New Jersey to private interests. It was years it was held by these private landowners, basically. And it took years for the condemnation for New Jersey to make the decision to go through the condemnation, to get the money, because you're talking close to $25 million to do this thing, as far as the condemnation, and then to go through the condemnation process. It took years and years and years and years, and I know, it's not what people want to hear, but that's the history of it, and that's what happens when you let a rail line go to the point of the rail being lifted. This is what happens. It takes years to come back, and not trying to make excuses, but that's just the facts, and that's what happens when a rail line is not only abandoned but liquidated.
Well, the thing is, with most rail lines, in a sense, you don't have this problem. In other words, most rail lines, when they're abandoned, no one's really thinking about, well, we're going to think about bringing this back right away. And actually, that thinking was already there before the rail was removed. So this was an effort that, in a sense, goes back to almost, in a sense, to the days that where the line was put out of service, where the threat was obvious at that point, and it played out over the next 5 years after that in New Jersey. But the effort never died.
Right. It was kept alive, and that's a very good point. It was kept alive, and again, it was kept alive, like I said before, at the grassroots level, at the counties level. The counties knew that there was no one else there. There were no private interests. There was no other interests. There was nobody else around that wanted it, and they had to make the conscious decision to take the risk of saving it for future generations, and it was kept alive. The dream was kept alive, and as long as that dream is alive, the entire thing will be put back.
And that's where we are today. We have the cutoff that has been purchased. It is fortunately in state hands now. You have New Jersey Transit, albeit slowly, working its way to Andover, and you have the possibility of Amtrak for service west of Andover to Scranton. We'll see. But the abandonment process, you have to remember that the abandonment process is one that really endangered the cutoff, and it came pretty close. There were the possibilities that it could have been destroyed, and fortunately it wasn't. So that's the story. So that's the end of part 46. I hope you look forward to part 47 on the Lackawanna Cut-Off.